Hi, everybody. This is Bill Owen at the microphone with another podcast. Oh, a real challenge today. We're going to be talking about the greatest painters of all time. That certainly is completely subjective, but we'll try. And as we go through those great names of the past, we'll certainly learn a few things about the world's great artists. I'd like to dedicate this to a friend of mine from Air Force days, Phil Metzger, who was born in Brooklyn but grew up in Kingston, New York, and now lives up in Youngsville, North Carolina. And what a wonderful guy. He's a great artist himself. He didn't make this list, sorry, Phil, but I have a picture that he did of a snow scene hanging in my office, in my apartment, and I really appreciate all the artwork he's done over the years. So this is dedicated to you, Phil Metzger. Well, now, one of the first names to come to mind would be Rembrandt. Yes, that would be Rembrandt van Rijn. Rembrandt van Rijn. He was born in Leiden, the Netherlands, July 15, 1606. Became a very successful painter and etcher. He eventually taught nearly all the famous Dutch painters of his era. He was most noted for his portraits of contemporaries, of self-portraits, scenes from the Bible. Unfortunately, Rembrandt suffered financial troubles in his later years. He died October 4th, 1669, buried in an unmarked grave, isn't that sad, in Amsterdam. I visited his museum in Amsterdam, and they have so many of his marvelous works. Rembrandt. Among his best-known works, Andromeda Chained to the Rocks. Do you know that one? There's one called The Night Watch, and then one they brought to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and I made a trip down just to see it. Was Aristotle Contemplating a Bust of Homer, a very famous work. We come to Michelangelo, more accurately, Michelangelo Buonarroti Simone. He lived 2 centuries earlier than Rembrandt. Incredible painting of scenes from Genesis. You know all about that, on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican in Rome. If you're ever in the Vatican, you have to make a trip to see the Sistine Chapel, a work of Michelangelo. Michelangelo's prayer, I was always impressed by. He said one time, "Oh God, grant me more to do than I can ever possibly finish in my lifetime." Isn't that wonderful? Now, before the age of 30, he sculpted the famous Pietà, which they brought to the 1964 New York World's Fair. And I watched that on a I guess I'd call it a flat escalator, a little moving platform that you went by the Pietà, so you didn't dilly-dally and hold up the crowds. But that was quite a thrill to see that. David, the famous statue. Now, it's often claimed that Michelangelo lay on his back to paint the Sistine Chapel. You've heard that story possibly, but in fact, he built his own scaffold for the task so that he could stand. It took him 4 years. Can you imagine that? Rafael da Urbino. He lived only 37 years, so what a full lifetime he had in the world of art. He was orphaned at the age of 11. His most famous work is The School of Athens. And we come to Leonardo da Vinci, sometimes called just Leonardo. Well, with good reason, because that was his name, Leonardo. Da Vinci simply refers to the small hometown he came from. Certainly one of the world's greatest geniuses, what they call today a polymath. And the most famous portrait of all time, certainly the Mona Lisa with her enigmatic expression, the famous Mona Lisa smile. He was also well known for his painting titled The Last Supper, remembered also for his notebooks discoursing on many subjects: anatomy, astronomy, botany, cartography, paleontology. Now here's an interesting thing. The 2 French names that are often confused, Edouard Manet and Claude Monet, the A or the O. Well, there should be confusion. First of all, they were contemporaries. They were very close friends. Manet, his lifetime was from 1832 to 1883, and Monet from 1840 to 1926. And Manet they're both Impressionists. Manet was known for his abrupt contrasts of light and shadow, and Monet for landscapes and seascapes. Monet's perhaps most famous is Luncheon on the Grass, Déjeuner sur l'herbe. And the Monet series of water lilies paintings comes to mind. Here's another Michelangelo, Caravaggio, 38 years old. That was his lifetime. The Temptation of St. Matthew. Another big name in the art world. Very big name. Pablo Picasso. Well, he was Spanish, but he lived mostly in France. He started an art movement known as Cubism. One of his most famous paintings, which I saw at the Prado in Madrid, was Guernica, which was the bombing by Germany and Italy during the Spanish Civil War. And there's an anecdote about a Nazi officer, while he was living in France under the Nazi occupation, looked at Guernica, the painting, and said, "Did you do this?" And Picasso replied, "No, you did." A very touching story. He had what they call the blue period and the rose period, which featured those colors. Oh, how about some Americans as we go down the list of great artists? Grant Wood from Iowa. He featured Midwestern scenes. American Gothic, his most famous, is a farmhouse. It's named because that farmhouse was in the Gothic style. If you can't have trouble remembering it, it's an Iowa farmer standing there in overalls, holding a pitchfork alongside his daughter. Some people think it was his wife, but it actually was his daughter. Very famous picture. Edward Hopper, the School of Realism, is from Nyack, New York. He's a great hero up there. I've been in his home many times, which is now a museum. And his most famous picture is about an all-night diner. It's titled Nighthawks. There's three people sitting there late at night. Norman Rockwell, America's beloved artist of the Saturday Evening Post covers. You know, he did 321 covers for the Post, including the Four Freedoms series and the famous triple self-portrait. He had a great sense of humor as he painted himself. The triple self-portrait. Another American, James Mcneil Whistler. You know his most famous, don't you? Yes, Whistler's Mother, but that's not the name of it. It's titled simply Arrangement in Gray and Black No. 1, but I like when it's called Whistler's Mother, and it was indeed his mother. Interesting story about Whistler. He was a cadet at West Point, on the banks of the Hudson in New York, and he was actually kicked out of West Point by the then superintendent, Robert E. Lee. Why? He couldn't take authority. He didn't like authority. He was just not built for the military. And Superintendent Lee finally had him dismissed, and he went on to better things, obviously. Then there's Jackson Pollock, the American abstract expressionist. He lived only 44 years. He was killed in a one-car auto accident, they say involving alcohol, sadly. His métier was to splash paint onto a horizontal surface, like a canvas tarpaulin. We have to mention Andy Warhol, famous for his pop art and the Campbell soup cans. You may have seen those. El Greco, I visited his home in Toledo, Spain. He was Greek, that's what it means, of course, the Greek, El Greco. The Adoration of the Shepherds, The Assumption of the Virgin, many other great works. The Spaniard Francisco Goya, famous for the nude Maha and the sequel, the clothed Maha. The same woman, the same situation, but one clothed and one unclothed on a bed of pillows. Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch artist, from 1853 to 1890, again, a very short life. Most famous, or infamous, we might say, for mutilating his own ear after he had an argument with his good friend Paul Gauguin. And he capitalized that by drawing the self-portrait with a bandaged ear. Maybe you've seen that. Gauguin, being French, lived from 1848 to 1903. He spent 10 years in French Polynesia painting landscapes. We've got another list here. Diego Velasquez, his works hang in the Prado also. Spanish artist, the most famous work, The Old Woman Frying Eggs. Then there's Salvador Dali, favorite of so many people, the Spanish surrealist. Remember the melting watches? It's called The Persistence of Memory. You can look at that picture and look at it and try to figure out what he had in mind. He painted that the year I was born, 1931. How about some women to mention? The Mexican Frida Kahlo, who was twice married to the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. There's Artemisia Gentileschi, the Italian woman. Mary Cassatt from Pennsylvania. Georgia O'Keeffe wound up in New Mexico. She lived to be 98 years old, worked right up to the end. The Frenchman Paul Cézanne, famous for The Boy in the Red Vest. Pierre Renoir, another Frenchman, Girls at the Piano. And who's famous for The Ballet Dancers, of course, you know that one. Edgar Degas. There was a Spanish muralist named Joseph Sert we want to mention, and the Dutchman Johannes Vermeer. Frans Hals, also from the Netherlands. And an Englishman is in the mix for his famous landscapes, J.M.W. Turner. Here's one of my favorites, Rene Magritte, a Belgian surrealist. And one of his famous works is what appears to be a drawing of a pipe, and it's titled, This Is Not a Pipe. And you scratch your head and say, wait a minute, it is a pipe. No, it's not. It's an image of a pipe. That was his sense of humor. Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, Flemish painter, The Temptation of St. Matthew. There's Georges Seurat, the Frenchman, famous for his pointillism, where dots, just simple dots, form an image. There's Henri Matisse, a Frenchman, for La Danse, the dance, noted for his very unusual use of colors. Oh, we have a few more to mention. Andrea Del Sarto. He was born as Andrea Dagnolo. Why did he become known as Del Sarto? His father was a tailor. Sarto is Italian for tailor, so he was called Del Sarto, or the tailor's son. A Norwegian expressionist you may have heard of, Edvard Munch. Looks like Munch, M-U-N-C-H, Edvard Munch. And his most famous work, The Scream. That's terrifying to look at, that agonized face. If you've ever seen it, you probably won't forget it. There was Anthony van Dyke, a Flemish artist. He wore what is now called a Van Dyke beard, which is simply a mustache and a goatee with no hair on the cheeks. Became very, very stylish, and he painted several subjects wearing a Van Dyke beard. There's Winslow Homer, often called the greatest American painter of the 19th century. He painted ships, most famously, and other marine scenes. There was Fra Angelico, a Dominican friar noted for his frescoes. Fra Giovanni was what he was called by his contemporaries, but we know him as Fra Angelico. And there were some famous black American painters we want to touch on. Men such as Jacob Lawrence and Kehinde Wiley. Women such as Augusta Savage and Caro Walker. A French landscapist, also did portraits, was Jean Caro. Oh, one of my favorite memories is discovering the work of Grandma Moses. Her name was Anna Moses. She didn't start serious painting until she was 78 years old. She lived to be 101, and most noted for painting simple farm scenes, but very brilliant works. Hans Holbein, the German, also did stained glass windows and book printing. He's from the 16th century. Oh, another Dutchman, Jan Steen. He was also born in Leiden, where Rembrandt was born 20 years earlier, born there in 1626. How about an American portrait artist named Gilbert Stewart? Most famous for painting George Washington, the very painting that is still seen on our $1 bill. We come to the name Jasper Johns, another American 20th century artist, born in Augusta, Georgia, grew up in Allendale, South Carolina. He was an abstract expressionist, what they call him. His most famous work, most likely, is simply titled Flag. Not the flag, just Flag, done in 1955. It's just the U.S. flag with then 48 stars, and it hangs in the New York City Museum of Modern Art. And before we finish, we want to touch on just a few more names. Thomas Gainesboro, who did English portrait works and landscapes. And I remember as a young man seeing his most famous work, The Blue Boy. full-length statue of, the painting of the Blue Boy dressed all in blue. It was around 1770, and it hangs opposite Pinky. Some people think Gainesboro did both, but no, Pinky came along by Thomas Lawrence, who was also an English portrait painter, in 1794. And they hang opposite one another in the San Marino, California Museum. There was Rosa Bonheur, a French woman who specialized in painting animals. Marcel Duchamp, the French cubist. Marc Chagall, Russian-born artist, often called the greatest Jewish artist of the 20th century. And we wrap up our list of great artists with Andrew Wyeth. He's the best-known member of a family of artists. And I remember seeing Christina's World hanging in a friend's home. It was done as recently as 1948. It depicts a woman. She was crippled, and she refused to use a wheelchair, and she's out in a field. And lying in the field, she has very difficult for her to walk, and she's looking simply at a house and barn. And that's the famous Andrew Wyeth of the famous Andrew Wyeth family. Well, that was kind of interesting. Maybe you and I both learned a few things about the world's great artists. I hope you'll join me again next time. We cover a lot of subjects from old-time radio, the movie serials, comedians and comedians. We do sports, baseball, boxing champions. And, well, there's no limit to what we talk about. So I hope you enjoy it. This is Bill Owen signing off for now.